Hello and good evening all. Thank you for joining us this evening for another installment of 5 Cars That, where tonight we have a bit of an inverse subject to our last video, and we're going to take a look at 5 concept cars that, in my opinion, would have been fantastic to see at Le Mans. I'm Lensler, your host and narrator and researcher and editor and everything else because we don't have the budget for anything else. There's no particular order for this video, although I did start with the least race-ready car and end with the most race-ready, so that's something, but don't look for additional meaning in the order beyond that. There is also a separate video of 5 American concepts that should have gone to Le Mans as well, so that's why this video is going to be a bit more continentally focused. Let's get started with the Audi Avus Quattro. Audi has never been one to shy away from doing things differently. Back in the auto union days, their Grand Prix cars were mid-engined, well before that became trendy in the late 50s and early 60s. Then, later, the Quattro revolutionized the world of rallying with all-wheel drive. And of course, they were then later the first manufacturer to successfully bring diesel power to Le Mans. But in the late 80s, they were in a bit of a funk with their contemporary model lineup, generally perceived to be on the dowdy side, and as a result, sales were dropping. With the coming of the 90s and the new millennium on the horizon, they were working on repositioning the marque to compete more directly with Mercedes and BMW while maintaining their slightly more sporty image. Not sure that you could really consider them to be more sporty than BMW, but that's the branding exercise that we don't really want to get into. Anyway, to wow the motor show circuit and journalists, however, an updated version of the 100 with a new engine wasn't going to cut it, as they expected it to do for the sales side of things, and to that end, a team led by J. Mays, not James May, came up with this beastie, the Avus Quattro. Named after the historic Berlin circuit where auto unions cars had achieved fame during their battles with Mercedes in the 1930s, the concept was intended to hark back to those glory days while previewing the production technologies that would be coming to Audis of the 90s and 2000s. The most immediately striking aspect of the Avus was its bare aluminum body, polished to a mirror finish and left unpainted to evoke both the silver arrows of the racing past and hint at the aerospace-inspired future of automotive design. This wasn't a mere styling exercise, however. The aluminum construction pointed towards Audi's development of lightweight materials that would later manifest in the production space frame that they've used for cars pretty much ever since. The body panels were ultra-thin hand-formed aluminum sheets, and by ultra-thin I'm talking like 1.5 millimeters, over an aluminum space frame, creating a structure that was both rigid and remarkably light for its size, and brought the total weight for the car to 1,250 kilograms or 2,756 pounds all in. Entry and egress was by scissor doors, natch at the concept car, and the red leather seats inside had a remarkable number of handles for easy carrying. Propulsion came from a centrally mounted 6-liter W12 engine producing a claimed 509 horsepower and fed air through the enormous rooftop NACA duct, reportedly the largest single NACA duct ever fitted to a road car or concept. Or at least the engine would have done that if it had actually been real. The engine in the concept itself was a mock-up constructed from wood, plastic, and paint, as they'd run out of time in developing the powertrain in the lead-up to the car's debut at the 1991 Tokyo Motor Show. Why they had to ship it all the way to Japan to show it off, I'm not sure. Nevertheless, had the engine been real, Audi quoted a target 0 to 62, or 0 to 100 kph time of 3 seconds and a top speed of approximately 211 miles an hour, or 334 kph. This theoretical power plant was actually quite significant, as it represented Audi's first public step towards developing the W configuration engines that would later appear in a large variety of Volkswagen Group products. But it would take another decade before anybody could actually get their hands on a W12 engine in a road-going Audi or other VW, when the A8 W12 Quattro finally went on sale in 2001. In the Avus, power was directed to all 4 wheels through a 6-speed manual transmission and Quattro all-wheel drive, which by 1991 had firmly established itself as a hallmark of the Audi brand, both as a performance and safety advantage in their road cars and as the competition standard for, well, not just Audi, but pretty much all rally vehicles, unless you were Lancia and still kind of wanted to do things differently. But at that point, I think even they had given up and come out with the Delta Integrale. So, be that as it may. The car also featured 3 locking differentials, rear wheel steering, and double wishbone suspension on all 4 wheels, while stopping power came from ventilated disc brakes that were equipped with ABS, which was not common for the time, although not uncommon. I think Porsche put it on the 928 in 1988. The S-Classes has had it for a few years, so kind of expected. What makes the Avus particularly interesting as a potential Le Mans contender was its timing. At the time that it debuted, the sports car racing world was in a state of flux, which actually isn't that uncommon, with Group C's demise and the gradual shift towards GT-based competition that would prevail through the 1990s. Had Audi decided to develop the Avus for road-going use and then subsequently for racing, perhaps as a GT1 competitor later in the decade, they would have been entering motorsport probably right around the time that manufacturers like Mercedes-Benz and Porsche were developing specialized homologation nominal road cars for Le Mans, while Audi would have been joining McLaren in doing things properly and building a road car that then became a race car. We support this approach much more. The W12 engine, while impressive on paper, remained there for the time, and the development challenges that Volkswagen faced are the primary reason this car was first on the list. Had a working road-going W12 been developed in the early 90s, there still would have been significant additional development needed to withstand 24 hours of endurance racing. Had these problems been resolved, the use of a Quattro system then may also have been suspect in a competition version of the car, depending on the regulations of the class in which the car would be entered. I don't think GT1 allowed for anything but 2-wheel drive, but I could be wrong, don't quote me on that. Aerodynamically, the Avus featured a relatively clean design with a low nose, smooth underbody, and integrated, pretty minimal rear wing, again looking kind of like the Mercedes C112. While the concept's claimed top speed of 334 kph was probably a tad optimistic, its basic shape would have provided a solid foundation for the development of the more aggressive racing-specific aerodynamics that would be needed for high-speed stability as well as good downforce at Le Mans. Of course, the Avus Quattro never progressed beyond the concept stage, despite reported offers from prospective motor show buyers in the low 8-figure range. However, many of its technological underpinnings, particularly the aluminum construction techniques and aspects of the W12 engine concept, would eventually find their way into production Audi models. More significantly, the conceptual groundwork laid by the Avus arguably contributed, at least at a spiritual level, and I admit this is a bit of a reach, to Audi's decision to enter endurance racing later in the decade, which culminated in their dominant Le Mans performances with the R8 and subsequent diesel-powered prototypes, though of course these wore a less reflective gray-silver livery than something that would have blinded people in the noonday sun at La Sarthe. However, continuing with the shiny materials theme, let's talk for a moment about the Pujo Onyx GT. While we've covered Peugeot's various Le Mans efforts in other videos on the channel already, let's do just a brief recap for anybody who might have missed them. In the late 2000s, Peugeot was taking on the might of Audi at Le Mans with their exceptionally fine-looking 908 HDI LMP1, possibly my favorite Le Mans prototype of all time, kind of tied with the R18 e-tron Quattro. That would be a hard one to pick. Anyway, the 908 HDI FAP LMP1, which was powered by all of the letters in its name, as well as a big V12 twin-turbo diesel engine that brought them victory at La Sarthe in 2009. Come 2011, they had won everything except for Le Mans with the updated version of the car, simply called the 908 because the economy wasn't quite as healthy and they paid by the letter. And in 2012, they built a hybrid version of the car, the Hybrid 4, except they canceled that program shortly before the start of the season, just after the cars had arrived for testing at Sebring, and thus everyone on the team was disappointed and it never went racing. And Audi's new rival became Toyota and the TS030 for the 2012 season. But what if GT1 had survived as a class into the 2010s, particularly in its late 90s iteration where they were, not really GTs, they were just prototypes. Well, we got a glimpse of what Peugeot might have been running in our alt history Le Mans at the 2012 Paris Motor Show when they unveiled the Onyx concept. Though this design was intended more in a road-going direction than a racing one, the mechanicals underneath were pretty much lifted straight from the 908 hybrid, all dressed up in, well, a body that used what can only be called a very distinctive materials palette. The body combined carbon fiber, that's not that unusual, with hand-polished copper-gilded panels that were left uncoated, and thus intended to develop a natural patina over the time, which raised some eyebrows about the practicality of such an approach when it debuted. But this materials approach wasn't, entirely aesthetic, although it was pretty much just aesthetic. It was intended as a signal of Peugeot's interest in alternative, potentially more sustainable manufacturing techniques at a time when such considerations were becoming increasingly relevant, mostly to regulatory bodies, but also to some of the more mindful consumers. Let's quickly kick it over to James May to make some more sarcastic comments about the car.
Raw copper, which is an ideal material for making a car because it's very cheap, it is of course extremely strong, and it doesn't go green in the rain.
However, the Onyx's Le Mans connection was far more direct and less superficial. Its hybrid powertrain was directly derived from Peugeot's endurance racing program and paired a mid-mounted 3.7-liter V8 HDI diesel engine producing about 600 horsepower with an 80 horsepower electric motor generator that was integrated into the 6-speed sequential gearbox, all of which are mechanical gubbins that should sound perfectly familiar to those who recall the video on the Hybrid 4. The chassis was a carbon fiber monocoque with 12 individual components bonded together that weighed just over 100 kilos or 220 pounds, contributing to the car's claimed overall mass of 1,100 kilos or 2,425 pounds. Double wishbone suspension featured at all four corners with pushrod activated dampers, while the braking system utilized carbon composite discs with 6 piston calipers up front and 4 pots in the rear. The engine was a fully stressed member of the chassis, if I'm reading the French press release correctly, and the windscreen wasn't glass, but a plastic compound called, oh boy. No, it wasn't called oh boy, it was called some long polysyllabic chemical non-word. It's polymethyl methacrylate, which sounds tasty. Further evidence of the Concept Le Mans heritage, because, glass doesn't really go on Le Mans cars anymore. Aerodynamically, the Onyx featured a number of racing-derived elements, some of which were then taken a step further, including an aggressive front splitter, a flat underbody, a big rear diffuser, and a deployable rear wing, the latter of which, of course, being the taking it a step further because active aero has been frowned upon pretty much in every racing jurisdiction since the 80s and 90s. These features were developed with computational fluid dynamics and wind tunnel testing to optimize the car's downforce while minimizing the car's drag and giving us this rather fetching body style that we can see here. It also has slight elements of the, what was that coupe that made the RCZ? But, made much more aggressive and prototypey looking. The interior continued the sustainable materials theme with felt made from compressed recycled wool and newspaper wood, a material created from compressed recycled newspapers used for various interior panels and the dashboard respectively. While these specific materials would likely and hopefully have been replaced with more conventional, read fireproof, alternatives in a racing application, they did again reinforce Peugeot's conceptual approach to reducing one's environmental impact through unconventional material selection. The Onyx was, fundamentally, as we've seen, a fully operational racing prototype underneath, as the engine was actually in the car and did work, because I think, honestly, they probably just cannibalized one of the Hybrid 4s that they had built and then not sent racing the prior year. It was capable of well more than 100 miles an hour, and in true racing prototype form, it required a heater to warm all the fluids up before it could even be started. Yes, seriously, the 908s that are now in private hands are usually covered with blankets between racing sessions to keep heat in the engines, as we can see here, looking at Mr. David Porter's lovely 908 HDI FAP at Sebring Historics in 2020, which they've covered with some moving blankets that they bought at Harbor Freight. For those of you who don't have Harbor Freight, which is to say I think everybody outside of the US, it's kind of a discount hardware store, which is fantastic in its way, but you wouldn't really want to buy anything with a plug on it from them. But their moving blankets are excellent. Anyway, adaptation to racing spec would likely have taken away many of the more concept car-y elements like that newspaper wood dash and felt interior, but the mechanicals were ready to go pretty much out of the box, and I think the aesthetics would have been as well in a world where GT1 survived either instead of or adjacent to LMP1, which would mean that we might get to see something like this fantastic-looking car going up against a diesel-powered R8C successor, maybe a Toyota TS030 that picked up a little bit more closely to where the GT1/TS020 had left off. What else? Oh, the Porsche 918 RSR, which I honestly forgot about when I started this list and now regret not including. And I mean, honestly, if we had seen GT1 kind of continue in more of a 90s vein until 2012, who knows where we would have ended up. I wouldn't have been at all surprised to see Pagani, maybe Koenigsegg get in on the action. It would have been a fantastic alternative history. But, you know, maybe that's a video series in and of itself. Alternate racing history if, you know, blank class hadn't gone away or if some specific event hadn't happened. Those, however, are thoughts for another day. Anyway, let's head back over to the Germans and what's arguably a rebadged successor to the Audi Avus, the Volkswagen W12. The turn of the millennium witnessed Volkswagen in the midst of an ambitious upmarket expansion, seeking to establish themselves as more than just a purveyor of practical, reasonably priced vehicles. Gosh, that sounds a bit like Audi in the 90s. This strategy manifested itself in several concept cars that pushed the boundaries of what consumers expected from the people car's manufacturer, none more dramatically than the W12 series that emerged between 1997 and 2002. Named for the distinctive engine configuration that VW had finally gotten right after a decade of testing and development, it was essentially two VR6 engines joined at 72 degrees to form a W. These concepts served as both technology demonstrators and statements of intent regarding Volkswagen's engineering capabilities. The W12 project began with the W12 Synchro, designed by Italdesign Giugiaro and unveiled at the 1997 Tokyo Motor Show. Again, why do they need to go so far? This was followed by the W12 Roadster at the 1998 Geneva Motor Show, which makes a lot more sense, but it's the third iteration, the W12 Nardo of 2001, that represents the most developed and track-focused version, making it the most relevant potential Le Mans contender of the series. The Nardo component of the name derives from the Nardo testing facility in southern Italy, where the concept would later set a 24-hour speed record. Visually, it represented a moderate iteration of the earlier concepts, with a more aggressive aerodynamic package, including an active rear wing, front splitter, and side skirts that were optimized for high-speed stability and engine cooling. The body was constructed from carbon fiber, keeping weight to a relatively svelte 1,200 kilos, or 2,646 pounds, which is, not inconsiderable when you think about the fact that it had a 6-liter W12 engine in the back. That engine, mounted amidships, produced 591 horsepower at 7,000 RPM and 458 pound-feet of torque at 5,800 RPM. And those are actual figures, not projections like we had with the Audi Avus. And they are figures that would have been competitive in early 2000s GT racing, or slightly tuned up if Volkswagen was feeling a bit bold, even in LMGTP. Power was transmitted to the rear wheels through a sequential 6-speed gearbox, carried over from the Spider, and contrasting both the Audi Avus and the Synchro. As Synchro, it's worth mentioning, was VW's rebranding of the first-generation Quattro tech that they had borrowed from Audi. This rear-wheel drive configuration would have been much more advantageous in racing, as it does reduce both weight and mechanical complexity and avoids the uncertainty over whether or not it would be allowed in certain rule sets. There's not really any uncertainty, you just have to look at the rule book, but I don't have those to hand at the moment, I'm sorry. The W12 Nardo's suspension utilized double wishbones at all four corners, with pushrod-actuated horizontal springs and dampers, more entirely appropriate race car mechanicals. Braking came courtesy of Brembo-ventilated discs with 6-pot calipers up front and 4 pots in the rear, again, about standard for anything that was going to go do sporting things. But what earned the W12 Nardo inclusion on this list as a potential future Le Mans competitor in an alt-history circumstance was its demonstrated endurance capability. As we mentioned, in February 2002, a slightly modified version of the car set a world record by covering 4,810 miles, or 7,740 kilometers, at an average speed of 200.6 miles an hour, or 323 kph, over 24 hours at the Nardo test ring. During this record attempt, the car reached a top speed of 221.8 miles an hour, which is 357 kph, and reportedly experienced no significant mechanical difficulties, and required only routine fuel and tire changes to achieve the record. Had Volkswagen decided to develop the W12 Nardo for Le Mans competition, they would have been entering at, well, kind of another transitional period in sports car racing. The factory-backed GT1 cars that definitely weren't GTs of the late 90s had, again, given way to more production-based GT machinery for the early 2000s, but this does open sort of a two paths choose-your-own adventure where if they'd wanted to down-tune the car a little bit, they could have gone racing in more modern GT1 against things like the Corvette C5R, and then slightly later the Ferrari 550 GTS that ProDrive built, or if they'd wanted to kind of uprate the car and really get serious about it, they could have gone for LMGTP, which would have allowed them to take more weight out of the car and probably turn the power up a little bit more. The likelihood of either attempt was never particularly high, the LMGTP program even less so, as Audi was just starting out their dominance of Le Mans in LMP 900/LMP1, and Volkswagen Gruppe had just splashed water on Porsche's ambitions with the LMP 2000 project, this admittedly in exchange for their support on developing the Cayenne on a common platform with the Touareg, but it would have been a bit hypocritical to then turn around and fund another Le Mans program with a car that was far less developed than the Porsche. At the same time, Porsche was still not owned by Volkswagen, and they didn't own Volkswagen, so corporate politics aside, but had funding been found, or had Audi's prototype program been less successful, the progress that had been made on the W12 power plant since the Avus concept of a decade prior, and the capability of the vehicle design demonstrated by its Nardo record, show that
I could have been a contender. I could have been somebody.
Ultimately, the W12 Nardo never progressed to competition or production, despite production being promised several times through the W12's design iterations, with prices ranging from $150,000 to $200,000 at the time, though elements of its design and engineering would go on to influence various production models across the Volkswagen Gruppe portfolio. Most notably, the W12 engine concept would finally find its way into production in the Audi A8, also the Bentley Continental GT, the Volkswagen Phaeton, the Touareg, I think, had a version of it, as did the Audi Q8. I'm probably forgetting a few others, but all of these pretty much came in more subdued states of tune. At the same time, Ferdinand Piëch's ambitious vision of a supercar-building Volkswagen Gruppe would eventually materialize in a more upmarket form with the Bugatti Veyron, which utilized a W16 engine that did conceptually evolve from the W12 program, admittedly with 4 turbochargers strapped on. Keeping up with the Germanic theme and rather radical designs from unconventional quarters, let's go back to the 70s now and talk a bit about the Mercedes-Benz C111. Mercedes, having withdrawn from motorsport following the 1955 Le Mans disaster, were predominantly focused on building very good production cars through the rest of the 50s and 60s. But some of the designers were clearly getting stir-crazy by the second half of the 60s when they developed this, the SLX. There's actually very little information available about this car, so much so that Mercedes themselves have gotten confused about timelines when talking about it from time to time. But it was intended as a continuation and modernization of the 300 SL road car and the stillborn 300 SLR to stand as an upmarket companion to the newly debuted and more pedestrian W113 quote-unquote Pagoda SL. Initial designs morphed into a mid-engined halo car that progressed from sketches to a full-scale wooden mock-up and the start of wind tunnel testing before the project was cancelled. But the seed of an idea had been sown, and by 1969 a new mid-engined experimental automobile had been built by the Mercedes boffins as a testbed for future road car technologies, now dubbed the C111. The original C111 debuted at the 1969 Frankfurt Motor Show, sporting gull-wing doors reminiscent of the 300 SL, but thoroughly reworked with modern fiberglass-reinforced plastic bodywork over a steel chassis. The truly revolutionary aspect, or innovative aspect, however, was its power plant, a mid-mounted three-rotor Wankel engine producing approximately 280 horsepower. Mercedes had been experimenting with Wankel technology since acquiring a license from NSU in 1961, though with characteristic thoroughness, they sought to address the rotary's inherent weaknesses in sealing and fuel economy before committing to any production applications. Though, had they ever gotten around to it, hint they didn't, this would have come in a much more sensibly shaped package, as Mercedes debuted the C11 with the adamant statement that it was never going to be for sale. By 1970, Mercedes had developed the C111-2, or -II for those of us who have trouble understanding Roman numerals, which featured a more powerful four-rotor Wankel, displacing 2.4 liters equivalents, which technically was 600 cc per rotor chamber, and generating about 350 horsepower, which was pretty good for the era. The engine could propel the C111-2 to 100 kph, or 62 miles an hour, in about 4.8 seconds, and onto a projected top speed of 186 miles an hour, or 300 kph. These are figures that, with a little bit more competitive tuning, would have been not uncompetitive with purpose-built race cars of the period, although still a little on the slow side. The body was also redefined with improved aerodynamics that reduced the car's drag coefficient to 0.325, comparable to the Porsche 908 Longtail, and notably superior to the then dominating 917K. What makes the C111-2 particularly interesting as a potential Le Mans contender was, well, A, the brand and a prospective return to Le Mans about a decade and a half before they actually did return with Sauber, and the mid-engined layout with its four-rotor Wankel nestled behind the cabin, which followed in the vein of the Porsches, Fords, and Ferraris that had dominated the latter half of the last decade of the World Sports Car Championship. Again, we had double wishbone suspension up front with semi-trailing arms at the rear, which were about de rigueur for the time. We had four-wheel disc brakes to provide stopping power because, drums had gone the way of the dodo about a decade and a half ago, and the car featured a 5-speed manual transmission that was lifted from their road car lineup, but if they had decided to do a racing version, they probably would have switched to a gearbox with dog rings for quicker shifts. However, unlike many auto show-bound concepts, the C111 series were really more intended as testing vehicles than styling exercises or to show off Mercedeses of the future. They used the cars and accumulated significant testing mileage during their lifetime, while the model would go on to set numerous speed records in later iterations throughout the 1970s. The C111-2 demonstrated a remarkable combination of both high-speed stability and far greater usability than these later iterations, and the gull-wing doors would have made driver changes during endurance racing, excellent photo opportunities and a nice heritage piece, if perhaps not saving any time compared to conventional doors. Mercedes reportedly received numerous blank checks from eager buyers at the Geneva Motor Show where the C111-2 was displayed, but the company, again, had no intent on putting it into production, viewing the vehicle strictly as an engineering exercise. This reluctance to produce the car commercially did extend to motor racing as well. Despite its potential, Mercedes held fast to their post-1955 motorsport abstention policy, and they would continue until the mid-1980s and their partnership with Sauber. Had, however, in an alt history, Mercedes decided to develop the C111 for Le Mans, they would still have faced significant challenges with the Wankel engine's fuel consumption, a problem which would later plague many of Mazda's attempts as well. The rotary engine's thirst would have necessitated either a larger fuel tank or more frequent pit stops compared to competitors, and they would have had to up the power beyond 350 bhp. It's fine for a road car, but you had the Porsche 917 producing, 500 plus, and that, just continued to increase over the progression of the 70s, so maybe they wouldn't have ended up with a Wankel engine. But it still would have been fantastic to see Mercedes and Porsche going at it hammer and tongs down Circuit de la Sarthe. Either way, while the car's racing prospects were stillborn because of the Mercedes stone wall, the C111 would have been, I think, well suited for a Group 6 entry. Probably it would have needed a power plant change. I'm kind of reneging on my initial thoughts on that after thinking more about it overnight between writing this script and recording it, but had they put a more suitable engine in it, they probably would have had a Porsche 917 Challenger had they, committed to a full factory racing program. Instead, the C111 continued as a purely experimental platform, eventually abandoning the rotary engine in favor of initially a diesel and later turbocharged conventional engines for record-setting attempts with ever more streamlined bodies that started to hew more closely to the older Rekordwagens from the pre-war period. Though, of course, you're never going to fit a tuned 44.5-liter supercharged V12 lifted from a Messerschmitt BF109 in the back of a C111 because A, it wouldn't fit, and B, it would have turned the test driver into, so much jelly had it ever been fired up. I don't think the T80 ever would have really worked, which is a shame, but, kind of look at the thing. Anyway, let's head back to this century to finish up with what is decidedly the most race-prepared of our cars tonight, and another rotary-powered car to boot, the Mazda Furai. Few recent concept cars have captured the hearts and minds of automotive enthusiasts, or ended in such heartbreaking fashion as the Mazda Furai. Unveiled at the 2008 North American International Auto Show in Detroit, the Furai, which is Japanese for Sound of the Wind, represented the culmination of Mazda's Nagare design language, while simultaneously serving as a new rolling laboratory for the company's alternative powertrain technologies. More significantly for our purposes, it was explicitly designed as a bridge between Mazda's road car lineup and their occasional motorsport activities, particularly their endurance racing program. I say that like they had any other racing going on in the mid-2000s. I don't think they did. Actually, hang on, let me go look this up. Yeah, okay, apart from the fact that, somebody's always racing a Miata, I don't think there was really anything notable going on, at least that was factory supported. So, the Furai's racing connections, again, went much more than skin deep. It was built on a modified Courage C65 LMP2 chassis that had previously been powered by a Mazda engine in the American Le Mans series under the banner of BK Motorsports. Thus, we had an aluminum and carbon fiber monocoque, but the comparatively pedestrian open-topped LMP2 bodywork was replaced by something that, in my opinion, was much, much better. This foundation provided both legitimate racing pedigree and ensured that the concept's performance capabilities, like that of the Pujo Onyx that we already talked about, extended beyond just bench racing and computer simulations, and were actually genuinely track capable. Power came from a mid-mounted 450 horsepower 20B 3-rotor Wankel engine that was modified to run on E100 bioethanol. This was both a nod to Mazda's rotary heritage, though while the 787B had won Le Mans with a 5-rotor R26B power plant, the Furai's Zoom unit was a bit tamer. The choice of ethanol, on the other hand, reflected both the continuing focus on sustainability that one would expect from a French-led auto racing rule set, and the growing interest in alternative fuels at Le Mans and endurance racing on the whole. The American Le Mans Series, in which Mazda had most recently been competing, had introduced their green racing protocols in 2008, alongside similar rules for Le Mans, which incentivized teams to experiment with alternative fuels and more efficient powertrains. So, you also had Audi using diesel with great success, and one of the advantages of a rotary power plant is that you can modify them to run on just about any combustible liquid without too many big design changes. So, why not bioethanol? And while 450 horsepower is admittedly a bit low for most of the potential competition, LMP1 or LMP2, the Furai did weigh in at a mere 675 kilos, or 1,488 pounds, which is 225 kgs less than the standard LMP1 weight minimum. The Furai's bodywork, on the other hand, penned by Mazda's design team under Franz von Holzhausen and Lorenz Vannenacker, was done in collaboration with Swift Engineering, which is much easier to pronounce, and translated the flowing Nagare design language into more functional aerodynamics and race car-focused bodywork. The carbon fiber bodywork surfaces channeled airflow to generate downforce while managing cooling for the mid-mounted rotary engine, because, as we all know, rotary engines make a lot of heat. Prominent and sculpted side air intakes fed the engine while continuing the visual drama that started with the front lighting. I call them filaments. There's probably a more appropriate word for it, but the integrated front splitter and substantial rear wing left no questions that this was no ordinary motor show concept car. Suspension was double wishbones all around with pushrod activated coilover dampers. Again, standard fare for contemporary prototypes. The braking system featured carbon ceramic discs, or possibly carbon discs, with multi-piston calipers, while contact with the road was through 18-inch BBS center-lock wheels wrapped around specially developed Kumo racing slicks, which meant clearly competition was on the table. What earned the Furai inclusion on this list as a potential Le Mans competitor was both its timing and the, I think, pretty clear intent behind the design. In the late 2000s, we were seeing the FIA, the ACO, and to a lesser extent, IMSA start to tackle the questions of, environmental responsibility and sustainability, because, buzzwords. And while rotaries are not necessarily a conventional choice when it comes to being an eco-mentalist, they are kind of Mazda's thing, and the use of bioethanol did show that they weren't being entirely tone-deaf with the concept. Of course, we all know that Mazda does have a storied history at Le Mans and with rotary-powered concepts, having won overall victory with 787B in 1991 after numerous earlier attempts and some class wins with the lower-numbered 7X7 series of prototypes, and the Furai thus wore the number 55 as an homage to the Le Mans winner. I do have to say I'm in many ways glad they went with the stealth matte black color rather than the renowned high-vis livery, though, because I think this is one of my favorite menacing artistic car designs of all time, and bright orange and green probably would have undercut that somewhat. However, had Mazda decided to move forward and finish developing the Furai for competition, there still would have been challenges, most notably with adapting the rotary engine to more modern endurance racing requirements. As we've said before, rotaries are notorious for their fuel consumption and their heat generation and their oil usage, all of which are significant disadvantages when you've got to go around at 24 hours with maximum speed and maximum efficiency. But they were problems that Mazda had tackled before and emerged victorious, so a modern attempt would not have been unprecedented. If Mazda had wanted to send the Furai racing in LMP1, as I've said, they would have needed to further uprate the engine to compensate for the additional ballast they would have had to carry to make weight, or they would have had to seek an exemption from the FIA. I think a more likely path would have been an experimental entry, along the lines of what we saw with Garage 56, but of course, Garage 56 didn't exist in 2008. We'd have to wait until 2012 for that particular loophole to open with the Nissan Delta Wing. Tragically, the Furai's story ended in flames, quite literally. During a Top Gear magazine photoshoot at Bentwaters Airfield in 2008 with Mark Ticehurst at the wheel, the Furai became the Fire Eye and was destroyed before firefighters could extinguish the blaze. The incident remained unpublicized and just the stuff of rumors. It was under investigation by Mazda for more than 5 years, until Top Gear was finally authorized to reveal what had happened to the car. There's no conclusive word on what started the blaze, but it originated in the engine bay, and Ticehurst wasn't initially aware of the fire until the chasing camera car managed to alert him to the danger. Some say it was an electrical fault, or possibly a fuel leak, but all we know is it wasn't put out in time. Ticehurst managed to stop and escape the car, but they were out of sight of the fire crew, who were near the pits, and with the wind on the car's rear quarter, the flames were quickly pushed towards the front of the car, and, as I think we all know, carbon fiber burns quite merrily when you give it some accelerant like E100 bioethanol. In less than 8 minutes, the car was completely consumed and then extinguished by the fire crew, who came too late to save the car from the furious blaze. Okay, that's 2 fire puns in one paragraph. We're going to leave it at that. The car's remains were secreted away to Mazda's Advanced Design Studio in California and have not been heard about since, but it's unlikely that the Furai will rise from the ashes anytime in the near future. Mazda did go on to build a more conventional prototype for competition in IMSA under the DPI rule set, but it lacked the Furai's fantastic looks, not really through any fault of its own, or its howling rotary, again, not really through any fault of its own, and we will talk about it at a later date, as well as why DPI never made it to Le Mans. That particular video script is looking like it's going to be a little bit over an hour and a half, so keep an eye out for that probably in May. And tonight, we're also going to have a brief dishonorable mention, as I just want to remind everyone that this horrible thing existed, cost the world a Lamborghini Mura as a donor car, and Mr. Colani had the temerity to call it a Le Mans prototype, despite it being about as well suited for any form of motorsports as Lance Armstrong and Andy Fastow are to lead a series of ethics seminars. While I won't belabor the point too much further, as I've already discussed the car in an Oddity Week video about a year and a half ago, I'm just going to touch upon the key points as it relates to eligibility for Le Mans. 1. Look at the damn thing. Crash safety would have been beyond non-existent, even given rather loose 1970s standards. I mean, the Porsche 917, you had your feet ahead of the rear or front axle, but still, you've got a joystick that looks like it came from the back room of an adult novelty store as the only means of controlling the thing. The 2 pylons that served as attachment points to the frontal pod from the engine unit don't look like they do really well at speeds exceeding 3. The inclusion of the French Air Force roundel makes precisely no sense, but again, concept, and the big plexiglass bubble would have ensured that any of the heat transfer mitigation benefits that you got from having the cabin separated from the engine unit were completely obviated by the fact that they would have been cooking the driver in a giant solar oven while blinding him with the glare from the all-white interior. Also note, no headlamps, so the midnight to 5 a.m. stints would have been particularly fun. Back in slightly less polemic worlds, of course, none of these concepts ever made it to Le Mans or any of the world's other racetracks for a competitive outing, but to me they do represent tantalizing what might have been if the wheel of fate had turned a slightly different way. Equally interesting is the fact that several of these manufacturers either did find future or have past success at La Sarthe, albeit with different machinery. Audi, of course, built their dynasty not with a W12-powered shiny aluminum coupe, but with the open-topped R8 and its diesel-powered successors. And yes, the R18, of course, was closed cockpit, while Mazda and Peugeot already had victory behind them before they built the cars that we looked at today. Would any of these concepts have been actually successful had they been developed for Le Mans? Of course, it's impossible to know with certainty, but I think each possessed characteristics that align with contemporaneous racing regulations and the technical mores of the time. The C111-2's aerodynamics and generally thoughtful design, the Avus Quattro's lightweight construction, the W12 Nardo's demonstrated capacity to run for 24 hours with no particular issues, the Onyx's clearly Le Mans-derived hybrid powertrain, and the Furai's pretty inarguable competition pedigree all represented approaches that would have probably provided at least a chance at victory in endurance racing had additional development work been undertaken. Perhaps in some parallel universe, we had the C111-2 challenging the Porsche 917 for dominance in 1972, The Avus Quattro competing against the McLaren F1 GTR in 1995 in GT1. We had the W12 Nardo dueling with the Audi R8 and the Pescarolos and the, what the hell was that thing? The Cadillac LMP in the early 2000s. We had the Onyx facing off against Toyota and Audi in a combined GT LMP1 class. And we had the Furai carrying Mazda's rotary flame back. Oh, that's a third or fourth flame pun. Never mind. Hopefully, also in a parallel universe, the Kalani never cost us a Mura. Well, it's happened again. You've wasted another 3/4 of an hour watching/listening to me ramble on about cars that never were. I do hope it's been an enjoyable spend of time. For this week's shameless plugs for relevant content on the channel, I'm probably going to miss a couple, but we've previously discussed. Group C as a class and history has its own video that probably merits an expansion at some point in the not terribly distant future, but I've got a few other pretty big video projects in the works, so that's probably not going to happen until June. We have the McLaren F1 GTR recently covered. GT1 gets discussed in DEFCON GT. GT classes explained with Nuclear War. The Peugeot 908 HDI has a 5-minute guide, while the Hybrid 4 was in an earlier 5 cars. That video, the Audi R8 guide, was the first video on the channel, has had one re-record, and probably merits a deep dive because, let's be honest, it's one of the most successful Le Mans cars ever built. The Porsche LMP 2000 was in another earlier 5 cars. That video, as was the Mercedes 300 SLR. We've covered the Porsche 908, Mercedes W125, the Rekordwagen Streamliners, and the Colani Le Mans prototype, all in their own videos, although I'm even more unkind to the Colani in the full-length video, so if you want to listen to me just tear something a new one for 5 or 6 minutes, that one's for you, but it is quite acrimonious. For this week's call to action, not featuring the 3 sacred words of YouTube:
Like, comment, subscribe.
Remember to communicate, or over-communicate, your plans when you make them. Or you might be thinking you're headed into a nice weekend at a racetrack, only to find that your wife and your mother have planned a family weekend without telling you, and now instead of going to the Midi, you're going to a blueberry festival and a birthday party for someone you might have met once about a decade ago. Not that that's, deriving from very specific personal circumstances of the week. Yeah. Anyway, be that as it may, thank you as always for your time this evening, or whenever and wherever you are watching, and I wish you all good night and a good tomorrow.